Hi and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman and today I'm going to share with you how to strip up your stash and make this beautiful pumpkin quilt here. It's a striped pumpkin quilt. I have done it in some fall colors of oranges and burgundies. You can make this quilt in any color that you like. I do have a new pattern and I'll have that linked below that will teach you how to do that. The pattern actually comes with templates and you can certainly use the templates if you'd like to create the rail fence and the pumpkin block, but you don't have to. You can simply strip up your stash in 1.5-inch strips for the pumpkin and 2-inch strips for the rail fence blocks and make a beautiful quilt. So let's go ahead and get started and see how you can strip up your scrap stash and make this quilt. For my striped pumpkins quilt, I have cut up all of my strips that I'm going to need. I have my 1.5-inch strips here and there, and I have my 2-inch strips packed up in here. I will use the 1.5-inch strips for my pumpkins. I'll use the 2-inch strips for my rail fence blocks to create this quilt. For my pumpkin block, I need 9 strips. These are all 1.5 inches wide and they'll finish at 1 inch wide in the block. And I need 9. Although I cut 11 different strips, these are the ones I think I've chosen. So I'm going to create strip sets of this block here, of these colors. And I'm going to keep all of my selvage edges down at one end. In some cases, a few of these do not have selvage edges on each end. So I'm just going to make sure one end has all the selvage edges, which I can remove very easily, and then I'll be able to cut out my blocks once I'm done with that. When I designed this pattern in my EQ8 software, it did create some strips that could be used to give these corner pieces the right shape. I'm not going to worry about that though. What I'm going to do is simply create a square pumpkin, and then I will use a ruler and angle off those edges, and I'll make sure that I cut all of them at the same time so that they're angled properly, all the same. And I will also be appliquing these pumpkins onto the background. The one thing I have not yet cut are the little stems, but I'll do that later. What I am doing after I've sewn each strip to the set, the strip set here, I want to have all of my seam allowances pressed open because I think that's going to lay much flatter in this unit when I make the blocks. So I'm simply going through and finger pressing the seams open. I do have one of these little wooden sticks here to actually accomplish that, but I don't know, I prefer my finger. It works better. I can feel what I'm doing. I can make sure that I'm not folding in a crease there. So I'm doing the underside here first, and then I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to do the same thing on the right side. And I'm simply just putting in a nice finger crease on each seam allowance before I add the next strip. So now I'll add the next strip to this one. So from the strip set, I was able to cut 3 9.5-inch squares, and then I lined up these 3 squares. There's a thread there that's bothering me. I lined up these 3 squares, and on the mat here, I lined up the seam allowances here, and then I cut a certain portion off, and you could actually cut off as much or as little as you want for this pumpkin. In fact, you could keep the pumpkin completely square if you choose to. And then I did the same here. I lined it up on a line, and I cut off the same amount on the 2 corners. So I have 3 of my pumpkins ready. The one thing I need to do now is get a stem. The stem will go here. And so let me turn it around so you have it. This is the bottom of my pumpkin. This is the top of my pumpkin. I'm going to sew stems on here, and then these pumpkins are going to be appliqued onto a background square, a 12.5-inch square, with a beautiful stitch. I'm not sure which stitch I'm going to use, but I'm going to find a really pretty applique stitch that I can applique this to the background, and I'll use a contrasting thread. For my stems, I just went to my scrap box and I got 2-inch squares in a variety of nice dark warm colors. You could certainly just use the actual template that's in the pattern for the stem itself, but I am going to take these 2-inch squares and I'm simply going to cut them in half. I'll just do a few at a time here, lengthwise. And I'm going to sew them onto the top of my pumpkin. They're going to be shorter, squattier stems, which I think is going to be perfect. And then each of these will fit onto a 12.5-inch background square, and there will still be enough of the background square all the way around to be able to be seen, to show the entire pumpkin as well as its stem. Here are a couple of the pumpkins ready to go. I've cut out 12.5-inch background squares. I have already pinned this one on here. To get your stem on your pumpkin evenly, I just creased the stem in half. I creased the pumpkin, and I made sure I have creases on all 4 sides of this pumpkin, vertically and horizontally. Then I matched the creases and sewed a 1/4-inch seam allowance and flipped it up and pressed to accomplish this for my pumpkin stems. And I like the scrappier stems. I'm going to use a different one then for all of the pumpkins. And then as I placed it on my block, I made sure that the block had creases vertically and horizontally in the center, and the pumpkin has creases vertically and horizontally, so that I can match up those crease marks and make sure that my pumpkin is centered properly on the square. Now it's ready for applique. I like soft quilts. I prefer to applique without using a fusible whenever possible. So this is going to make a very nice soft quilt. I'll be able to do some really fun, beautiful quilting on here without any issues of that fusible, the stickiness with my machine. So I'm going to choose a nice, beautiful applique stitch, which I will use to applique this entire pumpkin onto the background. And I'm going to use a contrasting thread. I'm now working on my rail fence block, and this will be one strip set. Right now I'm putting together this strip set. I'm using the background fabric for one of the pieces in both strip sets that will match my pumpkin block here. This is the background that I'm using for the pumpkin block. So what I like to do every time I add a strip is I like to finger press this open, and you can use a wooden stick. There's these are wonderful little tools if you have it, but I prefer my finger. I can just feel whether or not I'm creasing a fold in there. I don't want to crease a fold into that seam allowance. I want it to be completely flat. And then after I've done the whole seam, then I'm going to flip it over and crease the other side with my fingers. And this is just finger pressing right now. I will absolutely go to my iron and press these strip sets, and I like to use a wool mat when I'm pressing my strip sets. Make sure that you're not ironing and pushing back and forth, because you're going to cause some distortion. Make sure that you press as you're pressing open those seams. Press each, lift and press as you're working across the seams, so that you're not causing a distorted strip set. So here are two strip sets that I have put together. They each have the background fabric that I'm using on my pumpkin block, and that will actually be placed on the outside of each block. But I'm cutting 6.5-inch subcuts from these two strip sets, and after two subcuts I've got enough for one block, and that's four of these 6.5-inch squares. And I'm putting them opposite, as you can see here. I've already sewn these seams this way. Now I'm going to flip it down and nest the seams and sew across that long seam there for the fence rail block. A really fast block to put together. If you're needing to put together a quick quilt, the fence rail pattern is phenomenal. There's so many things you can do with it. You can arrange it. If you use nothing but fence rails in your pattern, you can arrange it on the design wall or on the floor and create all sorts of beautiful designs. Here is my completed fence rail block, and I'm going to square it up to 12.5 inches, and then it will go with my pumpkin blocks. Let me grab one here for you. And here is the pumpkin block. It's going to be a very beautiful fall quilt. I love the colors of fall. However, you could change this out. Teal and white pumpkins are very popular. Pink and white pumpkins are very popular anymore. So you can really have fun with your strip sets, depending on whatever fabrics you happen to have in your stash. So this is the stitch that I have chosen to applique my pumpkin. And I'm using its number, I believe, 62. And I'm on a Singer Quantum Stylus 9960. That happens to be the machine that I'm using down here in my quilting studio. And I'm going to continue going around as I'm stitching this. And again, this is free motion, or excuse me, raw edge. There is no fusible in here. I just want to show you how I am stitching this. I need to come to the point here. I've got to continue stitching off the edge there, but I'm trying to follow. Let me see if I can point this out to you. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy here. I'm trying to follow that little point right there and keeping it on the seam allowance here or the edge of the fabric as I'm stitching. And that's how I'm making sure that everything is lined up. Let me get around this corner. I'm going to have to use both hands to do that, and then I'll video what I'm doing. So I've gone around the corner now, and I'm going to line up that little notch there on my presser foot, and I'm going to keep it lined up on the edge of the fabric as I stitch down. I think my pumpkin turned out adorable. I love it. Got a nice curly Q, kind of a lacy applique all the way around the outside edge, so that fuses everything down. It is raw edge, but everything is nice and secure, and it's a very nice soft block. There's no fusible in there at all, which I love. So that is my pumpkin block. I might do the applique on each of the pumpkins in a different design. I've got many stitches on my machine, and it's a perfect opportunity to use those wonderful stitches that we have that we never have the chance to use. So I might applique each pumpkin with a different stitch. We'll see how that goes. I used a brown rayon embroidery thread as I did this. And here is my fence rail. So I think this quilt is going to turn out adorable. I'm just anxious to get it finished, and I'll show you a picture of that as soon as it's done. I have a couple of blocks here ready, my pumpkin blocks, and I'm going to applique them. And one thing I do recommend that you do if you are not using fusible, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm not using fusible, but what I will do is put a light line of glue underneath this applique so that it's secure properly. This is Acorn Precision Piecing, and I love this product. There's a number of different glues that are out there that have this nice needle nose which allows the glue to come out just a nice small line of glue so you don't get a lot on your fabric. Roxanne's Glue Based is another product that's wonderful. But what I'm going to do behind this, on the back side of this quilt, I'm simply going to put a line of glue here and then press the fabric down just on the edge. And what that will do for me is just allow the fabric to applique nicely without it moving around and shifting on me. I'm going to go ahead and let this dry. So it's just a light line of glue based underneath at the very edge of the fabric. And I'm going to do that all the way around. In fact, I've done that with my different blocks here that I've already appliqued. And I have done some various stitches on this. This is more of a zigzag stitch here. Bring it close so you can see that. This one here is kind of another fancy stitch that I chose to use. Here is another fancy stitch, more of a circular stitch that I chose to use. So I'm just having fun choosing different applique stitches. I'm just using some fancy stitches from my sewing machine to actually applique this down.